Abdurrahman III ruled over a city that by the 10th century was the largest in Europe. Cordoba boasted sophisticated amenities like paved streets, lighting systems, and running water.
The introduction of water transforms the city. The city becomes cleaner. They have bathhouses. People can bathe at any time. They also have a system of sewers that runs underground that washes away the waste. So if you can imagine walking through a medieval city that did not smell, that is an extraordinary indication of high standard of living. And it is the kind of thing that people from elsewhere commented upon when they came to Cordoba, that it was beautiful, partly because it appealed to the senses, all of the senses.
The reports of the glamour of this city reached far and wide. And it's at that point when Cordoba really does feel to itself and to other visitors from both the east and the north is very much the center of the civilized world.
The German nun and poet Roswitha of Gandersheim never visited Cordoba. Yet the stories that reached her inspired her to call it the ornament of the world.
The brilliant ornament of the world shone in the west. A noble city, newly known for the military prowess that its Hispanic colonizers had brought. Cordoba was its name, and it was wealthy and famous and known for its pleasures and resplendent in all things.
Nothing better exemplified Cordoba's ascendancy than the opulent palace complex Abdurrahman III built outside the city. He called it Medina Azara and made it the new seat of government.
Medina al-Zahra was built on the side of a hill overlooking a vast landscape. And of course, overlooking the landscape was very important because that view exemplified in many ways your power over that land.
He builds it not as a single palace, but as a sprawling complex of multiple palaces, multiple mosques, multiple gardens. It is absolutely huge.
The palace had things that are spoken of by poets for generations afterwards. It had fountains with little statues of animals who spewed water into its pool. You know, you were almost godlike in your powers if you could control nature, and part of that would be to control water, to send it spewing through little canals and to have it travel vast amounts of territory on aqueducts and to spew out of the mouth of precious jewel-studded or gilded animals. That showed not only beautiful taste and luxurious appointments, but it also showed a kind of awesome power.
The city's resplendence extended beyond its architecture. It was also a place of learning, home to great book collections that stood in marked contrast to the small monastic libraries scattered throughout the rest of Europe.
The grandeur of this city lay in great measure because of the enormous numbers of books. There is a legendary recounting that says that there were as many as 400,000 books in Cordoba. There's a complete inability to judge the literal truth of this, but I think the statement is meant to reflect what was a reality, which is it's a culture that highly valued books as part of the overall culture.
One young Cordoban who emerged from this vibrant culture was the Jewish physician and intellectual Hasdai ibn Jabrut.
Most of the intellectuals in those days were physicians and philosophers. That is, they were scientists and they were thinkers. And Hasdai ibn Jabrut became a physician to the caliph or the caliph's court.
Hasdai rose through the ranks, eventually becoming the right-hand man to Abdurrahman III and the highest-ranking Jew in Al-Andalus.
Things had never been so comfortable for a Jewish community that they were aware of. Jews' influence in the social and political realm, as well as their social and economic accomplishments and their creativity and productivity as authors of all of the Hebrew humanities, had no parallel.
Inspired by Abdurrahman's determination to make Cordoba the center of Islam, Hasdai ibn Jabrut set out to make it the heart of Jewish life too. He launched an attempt to wrest power from the rabbis in Baghdad, which had been the seat of Jewish learning for centuries.
Hasdai ibn Jabrut established the first center of rabbinical learning in medieval Spain. And so Sephardic Jewry had their own academy as a center of Jewish religious learning.
And Hasdai was just beginning his campaign to promote Cordoba.
I think one of the most important things that you learn about Hasdai through his writing is his sense of the centrality of Spain.
A delegation came to Cordoba from what was called at the time Khazaria, in what is today Croatia. This was a Turkic kingdom that legend had it was a Jewish kingdom.
Hasdai ibn Jabrut asked the Turkic delegation to carry a letter back to the Jewish king.
Our land is called Sepharad in the Holy Tongue, while the Ishmaelite citizens call it Al-Andalus, and the kingdom is called Cordoba. It is a land of grains, wines, and purest fruits, rich in plants, a paradise of every sort of sweet, and with gardens and orchards where every kind of fruit tree blossoms.
It gives you a taste of his, and I think the rest of the community's, great love of this place that nourished them, that not only tolerated them, which is one thing, but which provided the wherewithal for this great well-being. The true flourishing of the Jewish community, which could be said to begin with Hasdai, at least as a symbolic moment, will continue and will in fact survive the destruction of the caliphate.
The years of Abdurrahman III were the zenith of Cordoban power. But the Umayyad Caliphate's brilliant star was about to fade. Abdurrahman III died in the year 961, followed 15 years later by his son. Next in the line of succession was his 12-year-old grandson, Hisham. But the young Hisham, though caliph in name, was just a figurehead. True power was seized by his ambitious chamberlain, who called himself Al-Mansur, the Victorious.
Al-Mansur is kind of an interesting character. Extremely despotic. He claims for a while to rule in the name of the caliph. But in fact, the young caliph is made impotent by him. And he's kind of a strong man in a lot of ways.
Al-Mansur, like his predecessors, carried on Cordoba's tradition of architectural resplendence, expanding the Great Mosque. But he also had a militaristic bent. He led a series of raids against Christian territories that went beyond any carried out since the beginning of the Islamic conquest.
Spain, during the Muslim period, was divided into three zones. There was the Muslim south, and then there were the Christian principalities in the north. And in between the two, the whole central area of Spain was a kind of no man's land with sparse settlements, but which they were constantly being raided one side or the other. What Mansur did was to turn these raids into full attacks upon the Christian north. And he read a great number of them.
In total, Al-Mansur led 57 successful campaigns against the Christian north. But the string of victories soon came back to haunt him.
The consequences are that the kings of Galicia and Leon and Castile and Navarra and Catalonia, who could never get on, after 25 years of this guy roaring into their kingdoms and taking their people for ransom and pillaging their wealth, they begin to collaborate.
Cordoba was further rocked by another succession crisis. He had managed to maintain his charade of legitimacy despite his lack of Umayyad blood. But when his son tried to claim the title of caliph, the citizens of Cordoba rebelled. In 1010, as chaos enveloped Cordoba, Berber mercenaries descended on the palatial Medina Azara, the symbol of everything they felt had gone wrong in Al-Andalus.
You can imagine what those marauders would have seen when they entered the palace. They would have been absolutely stupefied by the luxury that they encountered there. Every surface covered with carved stucco. Every floor paved in beautiful opalescent marble. It must have been a treasure house, and they sacked it.
When the destruction was complete, the Umayyad dynasty was finished, and with it, the era of Cordoba's greatness. With the dawn of the 11th century and the end of the Umayyad reign, Al-Andalus was on the cusp of a new era.
The 11th century is this wonderful paradoxical period where you have this virtually catastrophic political situation in that the caliphate has broken up and it's been replaced by a series of city-states, which are called taifas, and they're all fighting amongst themselves, plus the Christian kingdoms in the north. But in the middle of this political chaos, you have this sudden flourishing of culture.
It begins, indeed, in many ways, the most remarkable time in the Muslim presence in Iberia. These independent cities competed with each other, and in that competition, they produced a great upswell of commercial activity and even greater convivencia. This is the time when the pluralism that is supposed to distinguish this experiment in Al-Andalus really takes hold.
Instead of having one central court, there were now a whole variety of different city-states that were in competition. These different courts competed for singers and performers and poets and writers.
Out of political turmoil frequently comes extraordinary literary and artistic productions. And the same is true here with the taifas.
One of the art forms to reach new heights under the Taifa kingdoms was Andalusian music.
The most characteristic form of Andalusian music, the muashah, really begins to spread and become popular in the 11th century.
The muashaha is a form of music that's still played today because the melodies have been passed down from generation to generation. As music flourished, so did other arts. Some of medieval Spain's most important thinkers and writers lived during the 11th century.
The most famous of these figures in the Arabic-speaking world is Ibn Hazm, who's an extraordinarily prolific man and wrote hundreds and hundreds of books and was a ferocious polemicist. His counterpart, with whom in fact he had a great polemical relationship, is Samuel the Nagid.
These two great intellectuals fled Cordoba after the fall of the caliphate.
If you think of two figures that emerged from the collapse of Cordoba, Ibn Hazm, a Muslim on the one hand, and Samuel ibn Nagrila, a Jew on the other, both are struggling to make careers in the wreckage.
They shared much in common, but the course of their lives could not have been more different. Ibn Hazm was born in 994 into a wealthy and influential Cordoban family. The son of a powerful government official, he expected to follow in his father's footsteps. But the collapse of Cordoba derailed his plans.
In his early years, he was deposed from office and imprisoned, and eventually retired from public life at a relatively young age to devote himself to scholarship and to a kind of an intellectual rabble-rousing against all that he thought had gone wrong with Islam in Al-Andalus.
Prosperity has been changed into a sterile desert. Society into frightful loneliness. Beauty into rubble-strewn plains. Tranquility into terrifying difficulties.
Well, Ibn Hazm in exile is a cranky, roaming philosopher, writer. He wrote very bitterly and harshly against his enemies of every sort. And yet he's remembered for one book, which is a book about love. And it's this wonderful book that is called The Neck Ring of the Dove, or The Dove's Neck Ring.
I've a sickness doctors can't cure, inexorably pulling me to the well of my destruction. Consented to be a sacrifice, killed for her love. Eager, like the drunk gulping wine mixed with poison. Shameless were those my nights, yet my soul loved them beyond all passion.
It's a book about the different ways in which people fall in love, and how and where and when and why. But on the other hand, it's also a book about loss. It's got embedded within it some of his pretty explicit meditations about the tragedy of the loss of first love, of Cordoba. It's just filled with a certain kind of nostalgia.
Those rooms full of epigraphy, those adorned boudoirs that used to shine like the sun, and which, with the sole contemplation of their beauty, sadness fled. Now they are like the open jaws of savage beasts that announce the decline that is this world.
He writes of how heartbreaking it is to see the remains of what was once, a beautiful palace or a beautiful villa, and all of it is just flattened. So he has this sense that Cordoba is just a kind of ghost of its former self. You get the sense of a beautiful city that's just gone.
My eyes wept. My heart was pained. My bosom was saddened by these stones. My soul has risen in anguish.
He never got over the loss of the Umayyad hegemony, and he wandered all over, never found another home, never reconciled himself to his own exile. Well, I think in many ways grew increasingly bitter. He's an example of the ways in which, even though there was this great poetic flourishing that is the 11th century, that for the Muslims, this is a bad period. That loss of that caliphate and that unity and that political stability is never recouped.
Ibn Hazm's counterpart in exile, a Jew named Samuel the Nagid, followed a very different path. After the fall of Cordoba, he fled to the Mediterranean port city of Malaga. The story of his rise has been passed down through generations.
Samuel the Nagid, was a very brilliant intellect and an extraordinary Arabic stylist working in a spice shop in Malaga. According to this tale, his fame in this spice shop extended beyond his selling of spices.
The maidservant of the scribe of the king was sent to that shop to buy spices, and when she saw how eloquent his computation and writing was, she conveyed that information to her boss, who then conveyed that information up the line, and he became a person of interest in the positive sense.
Word of Samuel's talents reached the King of Granada, and he was invited into the royal entourage. Granada was one of the Taifa kingdoms, the small city-states that had emerged in the wake of the collapsed caliphate. The political, economic, and cultural competition among these Taifas was intense.
The Taifa king of Granada found himself in the difficult position of having many rival Muslim factions, none of whom he could really trust to administer his kingdom or to delegate power to. So he struck upon the solution of appointing a Jewish administrator and giving this Jewish administrator much more power than previous Jewish administrators had tended to have.
Samuel the Nagid quickly rose to the position of Vizier of Granada, second in power only to the king.
Now this is truly extraordinary. According to Islamic law, non-Muslims are forbidden from holding executive office over Muslims. But here you have the Nagid exercising executive power over Muslims in Granada.
Indeed, one of Samuel's most famous poems asserted that he was the general of a Muslim army.
My friend for me in my straits, the rock rose up. Therefore I offer praises, my poem to the Lord. He recognized fear in my heart and erased it. So my song is sung to the healer. He ravaged my enemies with pain, easing my own. Someone objected, "Who are you to pay homage?" I am, I answered, the David of my age.
Samuel's poetry marked an extraordinary innovation.
What he does is he takes the Arabic meter and Arabic rhyme and he puts it into Hebrew and takes the language of the synagogue out of the synagogue into the salon and into the vineyard and into the garden.
So beginning with Samuel, you really have this golden age of the new Hebrew poetry.
Gazing through the night and its stars, or the grass and its bugs, I know in my heart these swarms are the craft of surpassing wisdom. Think, the skies resemble a tent stretched taut by loops and hooks, and the moon with its stars, a shepherdess on a meadow grazing. Like beasts in their ample stalls, fleeing our terror of death. Like a dove, its hawk in flight, though we'll lie in the end like a plate, hammered into dust and shards.
Samuel died of natural causes in 1056. The extraordinary thing about Samuel the Nagid, truly unprecedented in Jewish history, is that he transferred power to his son, and his son, Yusuf, took over his office as the Prime Minister of Granada.
Joseph had all the talents of his father, except one. Joseph lacked the humility of his father.
That shortcoming was about to have terrible consequences.
When one is a vizier of a kingdom, you have to have a pretty strong ego. So it's not surprising that someone like Shmuel HaNagid would write a poem in which he would say, "I'm the David of my generation." He might write that in poetry, but he would be much more humble when addressing a Muslim of his class or status, or certainly the royal family. That might not be the case with his son.
Joseph lacked the political suavité of his father because he was, this word is often used, arrogant.
There was great resentment of the prominence of the Jewish community on the part of the lower classes, but not exclusively only there.
The very fact of Jewish success created new discourses, new ways of criticizing Jewish power.
In any event, there was a major uprising and there was a massacre in which Joseph was killed and the Jewish community was really slaughtered. And this was 1066, and it marks the first case of real serious Muslim violence against Jews as Jews in medieval Spain.
We have uprisings and revolts and assassinations in the history of Al-Andalus all the time, most of which have nothing whatsoever to do with the Jews. So in a certain sense, Joseph was the wrong person in office at the wrong time, and his community was an easy target. But from a more narrow perspective of Jewish history, it reacquaints one with the precariousness of Jewish life as a small minority.
The most important explanation of this is it's kind of a release valve. It's part of this view that medieval Spain works in these contradictions by having these little periodic explosions. And it's also true that even though you have this massacre of the Jews towards the end of the 11th century, that the Jews of that period still understand this to be a good moment. That attitude that Hasdai first articulates in the middle of the 10th century, that, Cordoba, Al-Andalus is the center of the universe, this is the best place Jews or anybody else has ever lived in, is still held on to. You'd rather be a Jew in an Islamic universe, certainly, than you ever would in the Christian North.
In the late 11th century, the Christian kingdoms in the north were growing in power. They turned their attention to Toledo, one of the most prominent Muslim city-states. In 1085, Alfonso VI, the Christian ruler of Leon Castile, brought Toledo under his control.
It's not just any old city. It is also, heavily symbolic for the Christians, it's the old Visigothic capital. It's like getting the capital back.
This is a great turning point in the history of medieval Spain because it's the first large Islamic city-state taken by the ascendant Christian kingdoms.
And Alfonso accomplished this momentous power shift without spilling any blood. Toledo's Muslim leader, weakened by years of conflict with rival taifas, gave Alfonso the keys to the city in exchange for a safe escape. The cultural richness of Toledo amazed the arriving Castilians.
These Castilians come out of a rugged, relatively primitive universe, relatively monocultural. And now they walk into Toledo, and it's a city filled with other languages, other religions, other kinds of Christians.
There was no city like Toledo in the north of Spain. No cosmopolitan city teeming with goods from around the world, with all this diversity of knowledge and learning. So coming into this city and possessing it was an extraordinary cultural change.
Alfonso VI called himself the Emperor of all the Spains.
So that means that Alfonso respects the status quo he finds. There are guarantees of freedom of worship in the same way that the Muslims had done. Really, what has changed is the guy who occupies Toledo rather than the culture itself.
But Muslims in the Taifa kingdom surrounding Toledo saw Alfonso's seizure of power there as a direct threat.
The conquest of Toledo by Alfonso VI worried the leaders of the other taifas because it did change the paradigm. Very often you might lose a military battle and now you would have to pay tribute to a different overlord. But you always maintained your own small kingdom and authority within it to some extent. The conquest of Toledo really changed the balance and seemed a much more drastic move that threatened their political autonomy.
With Toledo in hand, Alfonso's army stood poised to attack the great Taifa of Seville. Al-Mu'tamid, the king of Seville, contemplated his options.
There's this Alfonso juggernaut. And Al-Mu'tamid, as the most powerful of the Taifa kings and as the head of Seville, appeals against some of their better judgment, perhaps, to the Almoravids, the Muslim group that is in power across the streets of Gibraltar in Morocco.
Fierce warriors, the Almoravids had already conquered much of North Africa.
The Almoravids had a particular puritanical reforming brand of Islam. It had emerged initially as a religious movement that grew in political power. They saw the Andalusis as immoral Muslims, and they imagined that their military and political weakness was partly due to their having lost the true dictates of Islam and growing lax in their practice of it.
Al-Mu'tamid's son warned his father that the Almoravids were risky allies, but the king felt he had no choice.
I have no desire to be branded by my descendants as the man who delivered Al-Andalus as prey to the infidels. And for my part, I would rather be a camel driver in Africa than a swineherd in Castile.
Soon after the Almoravids arrived on Andalusian soil, they defeated Alfonso's army in a battle so savage, it was named Al-Zalaqa, or slippery ground, for the tremendous amount of blood shed that day.
The Almoravids do, in that sense, save Seville for the moment. But they also understand, having been there, that this is a place that's ripe for the picking.
A few years after their successful battle against Alfonso VI, the Almoravids come across again, this time uninvited.
Now, not to help Al-Mu'tamid or the Taifas, but to take them over. Al-Mu'tamid appeals. Who does he appeal to help him out? But the swineherd himself, Alfonso. And Alfonso, in fact, which is even more interesting, heads out to go and help Al-Mu'tamid to defend him against this predatory raid now of the Almoravids, but too little, too late. And not only is Seville and the rest of what remained of Al-Andalus taken as the colony now of the Almoravids, but poor Al-Mu'tamid is taken prisoner and eventually sent to Morocco to rot and die in a jail there.
The Almoravid Empire would help to forestall for centuries the ultimate Christian conquest of Spain. But under Almoravid influence, the culture of Al-Andalus was beginning to change.
The Almoravids brought with them the more rigorous, religiously austere, and legalistically serious culture. And this is the kind of culture that they imposed on Al-Andalus.
The Almoravids regarded the state of Spanish Islam as deplorable, as corrupt, as softened, and as altogether too much wedded to the notion of convivencia. Convivencia was a dirty word.
In practical terms, it meant something of an end to the free movement across religious boundaries, participation in a common high culture of music and art, things that made Andalusia distinctive as a Muslim society.
With the Almoravid rulers controlling the south of Spain, many Jews, Christians, and even other Muslims fled those territories for the diversity and religious tolerance still found in Toledo to the north. As the 12th century dawned in Toledo, the city's persistent intellectual richness helped fuel profound changes in the rest of Europe.
In the 12th century, there is this revival of learning in certain centers in France and in England. But this revival of learning is really a revival of Roman learning. What these people lack is access to Greek learning.
After the fall of the Roman Empire, most of the scientific and philosophical works of ancient Greece were unknown in Europe. But these works could still be found in the libraries of Toledo, which contained ancient texts that had been translated into Arabic centuries earlier.
In 9th century Baghdad, a school of translation was established to translate into Arabic all of the great works of the legacy of ancient Greece especially, of a medical, scientific, and philosophical nature. And these textual treasures were copied and transmitted all throughout the Islamic world, including North Africa, and eventually made their way into Al-Andalus.
These guys from London or Paris, at a certain point it comes to their attention that there's these libraries there where people are reading Aristotle, but you have to know Arabic in order to be able to read it.
So a demand arose for Greek works in a language that Europeans could read. A demand that was met, in many cases, by Jews who had fled the Almoravids in the south.
The way the translation seemed to have worked was it was done orally by and large. Somebody translated orally into a middle language, either Castilian or Hebrew. And then a second person would translate from Hebrew or Castilian into Latin.
All of these efforts of translation and production and dissemination in Al-Andalus and in Toledo produced what some historians call a 12th century Renaissance in Spain. And it is from there that the intellectual legacy of ancient Greece and Rome was transferred from Islam into Christendom.
Europeans were particularly eager to become reacquainted with Aristotle. In the 12th century, one of their sources were the writings of Maimonides, the great Jewish philosopher and scholar. They also read commentaries by Maimonides' contemporary from Cordoba, Ibn Rushd, a Muslim intellectual and legal scholar who became known in the West as Averroes.
Everybody needs a commentary on Aristotle because it's not exactly pellucid. Right? It's complicated stuff. And Averroes seemed to have understood it in a particularly trenchant fashion.
People didn't approach philosophy by saying, I want to find out what Aristotle, the great ancient master, had to say. What they said was, I want to understand Aristotle, and the best way to understand him is to follow in authoritative commentaries where they have explained and analyzed and arrived at the true understanding or interpretation of Aristotle's philosophy. And so Averroes, far from having a kind of secondary status as merely a commentator, was actually an authoritative guide to understanding what they were after.
Averroes tried to reconcile the apparent discrepancy between logic and belief, philosophy and revelation.
I think there was an understanding that philosophy really contradicted revelation. And that's what Averroes was trying to explain to himself, how this can be, how philosophy can say one thing and that revelation can say another.
He wanted to harmonize these two and ended up absolutely coming down on the side of the canons of reason. This was never the orthodox position among Muslim theologians, and for that reason, Ibn Rushd fell out of favor and really isn't studied very often in the Muslim world.
In the Christian world, however, his fame grew. He heavily influenced the writings of Thomas Aquinas, the philosopher and Christian theologian, who famously argued that faith and reason are complementary. By the time of the Renaissance, Averroes' stature was so great that Raphael included him in his Vatican fresco, The School of Athens.
Very often when we think of the translation movement, we think that Arabic culture and the Arabic language preserved the Greek traditions of philosophy and science that then were recovered by Latin Europe in the 12th century. But this is, I think, a real misperception of the situation. Arabic as a language had, among medieval Latin scholars, a great deal of prestige and status because it was identified as a philosophical and scholarly language in its own right. And so we can look at the Arab period and Arab scholars as continuing a tradition rather than just preserving it.
As the decades passed, Toledo grew as a magnet for scholars.
The Jewish community of Toledo dates back to the Roman period. This model shows how large the Jewish quarter was in relation to the rest of the city. One of the most interesting artifacts that testifies to the presence of Jews in Spain dating back to the 5th century is this washing basin found in the city of Tarragona on the eastern coast. The symbols of a menorah and two birds along with a lulav and shofar are typical of Jewish Roman period decoration. The inscription in Hebrew on the top left corner, Shalom al Yisrael, is also a common blessing found in Roman period Jewish synagogues. Other artifacts dating to the Visigothic period show that even under Visigothic rule, Jews were able to live meaningful Jewish lives. The Ibn Shoshan synagogue was first built around 1180. After a fire in 1250, it was rebuilt, displaying great architecture with Nasrid influences. In the 15th century, it was converted into a church. As you can see from the floor plan, a central apse and two side chapels were added in 1554. Its ground plan is an irregular quadrilateral oriented to the east with variable measurements, suggesting it was built on top of a previous structure. The architecture is a unique example of Mudéjar art in Toledo, fusing Muslim techniques with Castilian and Nasrid influences. It has 5 naves with horseshoe and polylobed arches, reaching a height of 12.5 meters in the central nave. The octagonal pillars and the complex decoration with discs and pine cones stand out. All of these intricate details are comprised of stucco work, typical of this regional's architecture. The main entrance door is made of wood and decorated with the Mudéjar lacquer work. It is surrounded by a wall and a garden of cypress trees, which provide a refuge from the hot summer heat and some measure of protection from the cold winter wind and rains. Right up to the Spanish expulsion in 1492, Toledo remained a welcoming and vibrant home for Jews, as was Spain for most of its golden age.